Okay, sorry, I know I ran out of time before. So the monopsonist is going to hire 100 workers. That's where MRC, marginal factor cost, or marginal resource cost, means the same thing, will be intersecting marginal revenue product at that quantity of 100 workers. The advantage that this firm has, being a monopsony, just like the monopoly has an advantage of creating a higher price, we can actually see a lower wage be given. And so the monopsonist will use the supply curve and will be able to get away with actually paying the $10 wage. So the monopsonist has that advantage. What happens to the quantity of labor hired in each of the following situations? If this particular firm, ignores the monopsony and actually operates in a competitive environment, we would kind of forget that this MFC curve is there at all. We would just have the upward sloping supply curve, the downward sloping demand curve, and this would be the equilibrium. We would have 200 workers hired, and the wage would be $15. Okay, if it was perfectly competitive market. Keep in mind the perfectly competitive labor market is the entire market. We're not talking about the firm here, right? That's something that you'd only graph if they asked you to do side by side graphing for a perfectly competitive firm. In this case, it would be the whole market. If the government imposed a minimum wage of $12.50, okay, what happens is when this $12.50 gets imposed, it's binding. It's something that is now the law. So everything kind of below this $12.50, the firm can no longer charge that or pay that $10 wage. So the $12.50 kind of keep on looking at it as the marginal factor cost, right? It replaces kind of this entire thing here, at least up until the quantity of 150. As soon as you get to 150 workers, in order to hire more workers, they would have to raise the wage. So assuming they're only paying that $12.50, the workers that would actually be hired is 150 workers, okay? And that's not because this is where MRC is equal to MRP. It's just that tells us if they wanted to hire the 151st worker, they would actually go, beyond the they would have to hire more than at $12.50. They'd have to pay higher in order to get those workers on board. In this case, we kind of have like a shortage, right? At this particular wage, the demand is, the quantity demanded for workers is here, and the quantity supplied is here. Okay, so if we're looking at this $12.50 of a wage, we'd have 100 people. But that higher wage now is increasing the number of workers, and we had 100 before when the monopsonist was profit maximizing. Now the minimum wage is kind of adding quantity of workers as well as adding the higher wage. Okay, the very, very last one, pretty straightforward. The quantity of workers, if this is a monopsonist, that's profit maximizing. MRC and MRP, the demand curve, will intersect, and the quantity that will be the number of workers hired or the number of machines that the firm is going to rent or whatever is going to be 10. The wage will actually be 20 because they're going to use the supply curve to kind of be able to pay the smallest wage they can. The dead weight loss exists because this is what the perfectly competitive market would have for the number of workers. So there's dead weight loss that exists right here. You can kind of see it shaded. If we had to quantify that, it's just going to be the difference of 10 times 4 times a half, and that would be $20. If the minimum wage was set here at 24, what would be the effect on labor quantity and dead weight loss? Okay, well, the labor quantity would be the same as the perfectly competitive or allocative efficient quantity, would be 14 workers, and there'd be no dead weight loss because you'd be allocatively efficient. How would this outcome be different in perfect competition? If there was an effective minimum wage placed on the market for labor. If there was an effective minimum wage and you had a perfectly competitive, market in perfect competition, minimum wage leads to a surplus, as we saw before in monopolistic competition. At least up until a certain point, the minimum wage could potentially lead to, in this case, in this example, with a minimum wage at 24, it leads to the perfectly competitive market. Doesn't have to. It depends on where that minimum wage is set. It could certainly be set up here and it would be as problematic. Okay. All right. I hope that helps, guys. And we'll see you in class. Okie doke. Have a good rest of the day.